On to this week's lecture. This week we will be talking about memory and the legal system, and we are going to be talking about the important contributions that many researchers within the field of cognitive psychology have made to the way that we think about how we deal with eyewitness testimonies and also with eyewitness identification and with other aspects associated with the legal system. So one of the things that we have to consider whenever it is that we're thinking about the legal system and the way it works with cognitive psychology is really in regards to this aspect of memory. Memory seems to be the biggest component associated with the way that the legal system and psychology really interact, aside from the clinical components that may come about with some criminal acts. So with potential clinical psychologists coming in and giving their testimonies in regards to their interactions with their patients or with the clients. But in regards to this aspect of cognitive psychology, we really do focus in on the aspects associated with memory. Now here, for instance, I've put two graphics for your two little cartoons that essentially really do represent the way that we think about this aspect of cognitive psychology and the legal system. Our first one that we have on the left, it says, none of them is it, but I don't like the look of the one that's on the end. That's actually a very good representation of the way that many decisions are actually made by some individuals in the identification of individuals. That just because we have someone that's giving us a weird look or that potentially just may look like a criminal tend to then be picked out as potentially being criminals, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later on. And then on the one on the right, it says, yes, Miss Worthy, I know pointing is rude, but it's important that we identify your attacker to the court. That ultimately looks at this interaction between the way that we behave and the way that we think associated with the legal system, that potentially there may be leading questions or that also potentially an individual may not even be comfortable with the identification of an individual. So in this particular case, the joke is that she thinks it's just rude, but at the same time, if you look at it from the other side, this may potentially be a leading question, that the person who's asking her the question is saying you have to point to the person that you think did it. So here, almost forcing them to go down that road. So both being very important issues associated with the way that we view this aspect of identification of individuals. So since identification of individuals seems to be a very, very big part associated with cognitive psychology and the legal aspects associated with the way that we interact with the legal system, we first have to really look at this aspect of eyewitness testimonies. Now, just to kind of set up the scenario for you, or to set up this idea for you about how important eyewitness testimonies really are within the legal system itself, we can actually look at the case of Gary Graham. Gary Graham was suspected of the murder of Bobby Lambert, and when Gary Graham was actually interviewed later on by police officers and also by other law enforcement agencies. They determined that a gun that Gary Graham actually owned was very similar to the one that killed Bobby Lambert, but it was not necessarily the same gun that actually killed Bobby Lambert. But yet they were similar guns, but yet they were not necessarily the same gun. 8 eyewitnesses were actually present during the murder of Bobby Lambert. 7 individuals were unable to identify Gary Graham positively as saying that yes, he was the one who committed the murder. 1 individual saw his face at night from 30 feet away. 2 eyewitnesses were unable to testify. Testimonies actually contradicted to the one of the identification. So even though 2 individuals weren't able to actually testify, those testimonies actually contradicted the one of the person who said that they actually saw Gary Graham from 30 feet away at night as the person who actually killed Bobby Lambert. So when we think about this and we think, well, what actually happened to Gary Graham? Gary Graham was actually sentenced to prison, and then he was executed on June 22nd in the year 2000. It was later found out that Gary Graham was actually not the person who was responsible for the murder of Bobby Lambert because of all the evidence actually against him. The one person who actually positively identified Gary Graham, unfortunately, that testimony was sufficient for them to be able to convict Gary Graham of Bobby Lambert's murder. But yet, Gary Graham was actually innocent in this particular case because eyewitness testimonies actually indicated later on that he was not the person who committed the crime. He did not even have the same gun, and actually he was not even anywhere in the vicinity of where the crime actually had occurred. So when we think about eyewitness testimonies and we think about the power of eyewitness testimonies, eyewitness testimony seem to be a very powerful issue, right? That we say to ourselves, well, just based on one person's positive identification, even though they may have potentially been wrong, this individual was sentenced to prison and then also sentenced to death because one person said, yes, that was the person who killed this other individual, or yes, that one person committed the crime. So when we think about eyewitness identifications, they have a lot of power. But when we think about their reliability, so in other words, are these aspects actually going to be the same time after time after time? So the identification time after time after time, is it really going to be the same identification? Potentially not. When we think about the validity associated with eyewitness testimonies, we again also encounter problems that, are they always 100% accurate? No, they are not always 100% accurate. But yet, eyewitness testimonies actually account for more than 50% of all convictions that we actually have in terms of those convictions in the legal system when eyewitness testimonies are actually included. So they account for more than 50% of all convictions that we actually have. But yet, one of the things that we find, and that we've been talking about across all these different weeks, is that memory, even though it may be highly accurate, it's actually not flawless. So in other words, it tends to have potential limitations. It has potential flaws that might potentially lead us to making erroneous conclusions, so thus identifying the wrong individual or bringing up the wrong information. How many of us are guilty of having said to ourselves, yes, no, I definitely remember this 100%. We talked about confidence in our previous weeks, that we say, yes, I'm 100% confident that I remember this content, and then you're like, oh man, I was totally wrong. All these other people are telling me I'm wrong. I was actually wrong as well. I had my dates mixed up. I had my times mixed up, whatever the case may be. So we find here that memory is malleable. Memory can easily change, and it's actually not that difficult to change a person's memory, especially if we have certain factors assigned that we're able to actually control for that can actually change a person's memory. And we're going to talk about some of those potential factors. Now, there are 3 videos that I would like for you to watch. Some of these videos are a little bit longer than other videos, so do give yourself enough time to watch these potential videos. I didn't actually show you the videos here in the lecture because then I may sometimes have problems uploading the lecture onto YouTube because they may be videos from YouTube, so I sometimes have copyright issues that may potentially occur. But I do provide the links for these videos, so please make sure to click on the links in the video lecture. And I've also put the links to the videos within the comments or within the descriptions of the YouTube video, so that way you can go ahead and click on those videos and being able to access them. Now here, once it is that you actually go through and watch the video, then continue on through the lecture. So after having watched these videos, the first video looking at how individuals actually recall information associated with an individual who was seen committing a crime. So this aspect of eyewitness testimony in terms of the classroom setting, that is a very controlled situation where everyone's looking in the same direction, everyone sees the exact same crime from every single direction, but yet people's reports of the individual who was the one who committed the crime are vastly different. Different height, different weight, different facial features, different clothing even. So one of the things that we find here, based on this type of research experiment that was done as an example, it again identifies for us that there is lots of problems with eyewitness testimonies, with the aspects of identification of individuals. Now, the last 2 videos here that we saw were the case of Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton, who Ronald Cotton was inaccurately convicted of having committed sexual assault towards Jennifer Thompson. And yet one of the most interesting things associated with Jennifer Thompson's discussion of Ronald Cotton, even though she's come to grips that it was not him, that it was somebody else who actually committed the sexual assault, is that she says that she still sees his face, that she still sees him having committed the act. And she was 100% positive. She was convinced entirely that Ronald Cotton was the one who actually committed that heinous crime. But yet we now find empirical evidence associated with DNA and other testimonies that actually indicated that Ronald Cotton was not the person who actually committed these crimes. So again, why is it then that we have problems with eyewitness testimonies or with eyewitness identifications? For many, many different reasons, and we're going to cover some of these reasons throughout our lectures. So when we think about influencing eyewitness identification or eyewitness accounts, what are some of the potential reasons why this may potentially occur? Well, one of the reasons that this might actually potentially occur is actually research that's based on Elizabeth Loftus's work, and Elizabeth Loftus being one of the most famous researchers out there in the field of eyewitness testimony. She's done lots and lots of research studies associated with these potential effects, and one of the things that she identifies is what we call the misinformation effect. Now, essentially with the misinformation effect, what do we find? Even though that we see an event happen, we give the individual misleading information, the person now mistakenly recalls the misleading information rather than the correct information. So even though they saw the event occur correctly, our suggestion, right, so placing misleading information into the context of what it was that they saw, so in their ability to recall the information, we say things such as, do you remember the car stopping at the yield sign versus do you remember the car stopping at the stop sign? So here, what we find is that if we give people the misleading information, people will recall the misleading information. So she actually did this in a number of her studies. One of the most famous studies is the stop or the yield sign study, in where she actually had participants view a video of a vehicle approaching a stop sign. The vehicle would stop and then go. And what she would then later ask the individuals is, did the vehicle stop at the stop sign, which is the correct information, or did the vehicle stop at the yield sign? And people would then recall later on, yes, I remember the yield sign, I remember the shape of the yield sign, I remember the location, so on and so forth. And they also inaccurately recalled what had actually happened to the vehicle. So in other words, when people were asked about the yield sign, people would say, no, the vehicle really didn't stop at the yield sign because it's a yield sign. And what behavior do you take at the yield sign? Well, you just kind of are looking to see what's happening and then you keep going. And here, people would inaccurately even recall the behavior of the vehicle in those particular instances. So here, very simply, providing people with misleading information now all of a sudden changes the way that they recall the event. So here we continuously see that even though we have consistent or neutral or even inconsistent information, even as days and weeks pass by, the information that they recall correctly begins to decrease. So if you look at the line for the inconsistent group, you'll notice that at the very first day, the inconsistent group is performing somewhere about 40%, about 41 or 42% on 20 minutes later. 1 day later, now we're back at 40%. 2 days later, we're about at 38, 36%. 1 week later, we're about 25% almost. So you see that performance begins to decrease across time. Not necessarily just because we tend to plateau like we saw here with the forgetting effect associated with what Ebbinghaus taught us, but rather with so many inconsistencies, you now start remembering wrong and wrong and more wrong information because the memory has to change to adapt to the misleading information, to those inconsistencies in that particular instance. Now, the second way that we can actually change an individual's account of their memory is through what we call the suggestibility effect. The suggestibility effect leads to this idea of having leading questions. So in other words, the way that we actually format questions leads to biased estimates or leads to biased recounting of the potential events. So if an individual says, for instance, how fast were the cars going when they crashed into each other versus when they hit each other, now all of a sudden we have changes in the way that people report the behavior that I was actually shown. And Elizabeth Loftus again did research associated with this with her very famous crash versus hit study that we talked about in some of our previous weeks, and we'll revisit it in just a couple of minutes as well. Even using leading questions such as the following: do you get along well with your boss, or is it true that you are happier now, are both very misleading questions. The very first one here, do you get on well with your boss, suggests that potentially there may be tension or potentially there may be problems, and the individual here, even if they say, well, yes, I do get on well with my boss, or no, I do not get on well with my boss, may potentially lead others to having a different idea. Because here, if you say, yes, I do get on well with my boss, it doesn't mean that you have a great relationship. If you say no, then it means you have a terrible relationship. So here, no matter really what you say, the interpretation is potentially going to be negative. Or is it true that you are happier now? If you answer yes, well then that's going to suggest then that you were unhappy before. Or if you say no, I'm not happier now than I was before, well then you see that situation that you were in was actually better for you than it is currently now. So here we see that using specific formats of questions or specific ways that we actually ask the question are going to change the way that people are actually going to interpret the information of what actually occurred. We also have what's called source confusion. With source confusion, we actually confuse the context or the content of the event, especially after time has passed. So using different types of strategies here, one of the things that we can easily do is that with time, if you now begin to recall that information, now all of a sudden different contexts begin to mesh together. So in other words, if you were like in a high school setting versus a college setting, now you may potentially figure out, like, when did that happen? Did that happen when I was in high school? Did that happen when I was in college? I don't remember, but I remember it was a school setting. So here now there's confusion of potentially when that event actually occurred, or even of the event in its entirety, of who was there, when it actually happened, if there's similarities between that and other events that you have experienced. So allowing the passage of time makes this actually a lot easier to do, because if you don't use that information very frequently, or if it did not recently occur, now it begins to become a lot easier for us to actually use this type of strategy and create that confusion. We can also use what's called an implanted memory paradigm. And with an implanted memory paradigm, very easily here, just putting in the information and repeating the information to the individual that you want them to actually think that actually happened makes it much more likely that the individual will recall that wrong information later on. So here telling people, no, 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 it was you. It was you who did that. You remember, it was you, even though it wasn't them. The more times that we actually tell a person that that actually occurred. Now here, I don't mean bugging them for 2 hours straight telling them it was them, but rather telling them, no, that happened to you. And then maybe 2 or 3 days later, no, you remember when that happened to you, and bringing that information up again and again and again and again leads to higher suggestibility of the individual to actually be able to say that it actually did happen to them. So here we see that the event begins to change, unless the individual is very certain that it did happen, or it's a very strong memory that they recall that it did not happen to them. So if it was something, for instance, that was very, very embarrassing, and here they're sure that that has never happened to them, again, is going to play a big role. And also their suggestibility. If they're not very confident if that actually did or did not happen to them, they may be more likely to actually take that information on for themselves. Now, what are some other potential factors that may affect eyewitness testimony? Well, looking here back to what we've previously talked about, the Pollyanna principle, looking at the positive versus the negative aspects of an event, we see here that generally positive aspects are recalled more than negative aspects of an event. And here, generally with negative aspects, we tend to fill in some of that information because we tend to ignore some of the negative information, or we've actually seen through some of our neurobiological rationales that here individuals tend to have increases in glucocorticoids, which hinder the activation of the hippocampus. So the transfer of information from short to long-term memory may potentially be hindered, and that's why we generally tend to remember positive events more than negative events. We also see the issues of mood congruence occurring. So we have higher recall of information if we put an individual in the very same or similar mood associated that they've previously been in. So if we don't have the moods being similar, we actually have decreases in recallability. We also see mood dependence occurring. So mood functions really as a cue. So if you have emotions that come up that are positive in their nature, it's much more likely that you're going to remember other events or other memories that are positive in their nature as well, since we have that cue functioning between memories. And we also see that the amygdala seems to be a very important factor in terms of the way that we process information. So here, leading us to being able to control some of the information that we're going to be paying attention to versus ignoring in our environments. Now, we also see that emotions tend to play a huge role in the way that we recall information, because again, associated with what the Pollyanna principle was telling us here, and even with the aspects of mood congruence, we see that emotions play a very, very big role in the way that we recall information. So one of the things that we find here is that if we have increase in arousal, normally we tend to have increases in performance. So in our discussion associated with the Yerkes-Dodson effect, that we actually see that the increases in arousal actually lead to increases in performance, and the explanations as to why this may happen. Again, at the lower end of the spectrum, we see here that people probably are not very engaged. They don't have any type of emotion associated with the task that they're going to be involved in, so they probably don't care very much about the task, so thus their performance tends to be a little bit lower. But if we have too much arousal, or if we have too much anxiety, now potentially our performance tends to decrease because we may now, in this situation, have a situation where we cannot focus our attention, we cannot concentrate on what it is that we're trying to study or even the task that we're trying to perform. So thus we begin to be too nervous, we freeze, we tend to have low performance. So rather here, if we have moderate performance or we have moderate arousal, that leads to better performance for us, leading to optimal performance. So having that moderate arousal is going to lead us to the highest point in terms of our performance, because ultimately what's going to be happening here is that if we do have different types of arousal needed for different tasks, if we engage ourselves in the task or in the preparations for the task, that's going to be leading us to having that high or moderate arousal. And here again, the moderate is what's needed. So if we engage in that task and we have moderate arousal, we then are caring about the task, we care about our performance, and we're going to try our best whenever it is that we go into that specific situation. But yet we do have to keep in mind that different tasks do require different arousal levels. So what is it that really would be the most beneficial associated with the memory task? Well, here, providing some type of emotional arousal associated with the content. So in other words, providing emotionality associated with the content, really thinking to yourself, I really do need to learn this information. Providing a little bit of stress for yourself and anxiety is going to potentially lead you to having better memory performance. Now, also of concern here for us is this aspect of peripheral versus central vision. So whenever it is that we're looking at information in our world, if information is on the peripheral side of our vision, of our visual field here, we're much less likely to actually pay attention to that information, and thus it probably not leading us to wanting us to focus on that content. Versus the central information, if we have information that's on our fovea, which is really going to be used for the focus of attention, and for the clearest view of that object, here now we're going to start seeing that we're really going to be paying attention to that information. Especially if something creates an emotionally arousing situation for us, we're much more likely to put our sensory systems, in this particular case our eyes, on that object or on that word, so that way we can really focus in on that information and really try to learn it later points in time. Now, again, visiting with the ideas of Elizabeth Loftus and with her colleague Palmer back in the 1970s, we find again this idea of emotionality associated with specific content or with specific words, that the content or the words themselves seem to drive what our perception is going to be of that situation. So in one of our scenarios here that Elizabeth Loftus wanted to look at with her colleague was this idea of, can people's perception of speed change associated with keywords that we use? So here, if we use keywords like crashed versus hit, would an individual's perception change associated with the way that they feel the cars were going in terms of speed? So what is it that Elizabeth Loftus and her colleague found back in the 1970s? They found that if they use different types of words such as hit, smashed, collided, bumped, and contacted, now all of a sudden perception started changing associated with the event. So in terms of how fast the vehicles were going, versus smashed, versus collided, versus bumped, or hit or contacted, we started seeing very large differences in terms of the speeds associated with that event that they supposedly witnessed. And here, everyone viewed the exact same event, but yet people's perception now drastically changed. And very interestingly, Elizabeth Loftus found that people's ideas of what they reported that actually happened during each one of these groups now drastically changed. For instance, people in the smash condition reported that there was blood, that the people were severely injured, there was glass everywhere. Even at collided and bumped, people started reporting that there was glass being broken, some damage to the vehicles, but yet at contacted, oh yeah, the cars just kind of, touched each other. There really wasn't any broken glass or anything like that, but yet they were still going a little bit faster than what we would assume here. But yet in smash, people were going very, very fast, and yet the damage was even more drastic, even though everyone saw the exact same video. So when we think associated with this idea of memories, why can memories potentially then be distorted, even though we've already talked about a lot of things up to this point? Some of the things that we do have to consider are, for instance, our schema effect. We've talked about this idea of schemas, and we've talked about how schemas fill in information for us. We use scripts and schemas whenever it is that we're in a situation like going to a restaurant that we expect certain things to happen because we already go with this preconception of what should happen during those specific events, such as walking to a Chili's, you are greeted by the hostess, you sit down, etc., 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 versus when you go into McDonald's, your behavior is going to be very, very different. And here we see that even with this idea of schemas, it can change the way that we actually interpret situations. So these two sentences are very, very similar to each other, but yet they provide us with different ways for interpretation. The first sentence here, 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam beneath them, versus 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam beneath it. So here, now all of a sudden, we start viewing the differences in terms of the keywords that we're using. So the schema effect actually fills in the information of how this scenario was actually supposed to happen. In the first example, 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam beneath them. It makes it feel or sound as the fish swam beneath the turtles, versus the 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam beneath it. It sounds almost as the fish swam beneath the log. Yet in both instances, the fish had to swim beneath the log, not the turtles, because remember, the turtles are resting on the log. So it's physically impossible for the fish to have actually swam underneath the turtles because the turtles are already resting on top of the log. So here, using these different keywords actually activates specific schemas for how things should function in our world. So them versus it now all of a sudden changes drastically the way that we interpret the information. We also have this idea of confidence is providing us with this idea of a memory illusion, that the more confidence that we have of a situation, we expect here then that our memory should be even more accurate. We've seen this in our previous lectures, that this is not the case, that even though people have a high degree of confidence associated with an event, that does not necessarily mean that they're going to remember the information accurately. We saw this with our primacy and recency example as well earlier in the semester when I had different keywords for you, such as wake, bed, pillow, rest, awake, and so on and so forth, all leading you to believe that sleep actually occurred in our list, but yet it did not actually occur in our list. Now, we also find that people tend to confuse real versus imagined events, especially with children. Children are a great example of this. Just the other night, my daughter woke up and got really upset at me, and she asked me why I had slept on the couch without her, because my daughter sleeps with us currently in our bed, right? Both of our children sleep with us, and one of the things that my daughter really likes to do is she likes to sleep on the couch because for her, it's almost like a camping event or something, so her and I will sleep on the couch, and then I'll take her back to her room, or I'll take her to the bed and just sleep in the bed together with my wife and with my other daughter, and it's perfectly fine. But the other night, I'm assuming here that my daughter must have had a dream about having slept on the couch, and that she must have seen me asleep on the couch, when in reality I was in the bed. But yet for her, she confused it drastically, and for her, she believed that, hey, you slept on the couch without me, and she was very, very upset. So it took her quite a while to actually get, to forgive me for her imagined event in that particular instance. And we actually see this a lot with many of our events as children. Jean Piaget, who's a very famous child psychologist, actually vividly recalled that when he was a child that he was kidnapped by individuals. Yet in reality, this event never happened. So we actually see that, especially for children very early in their ages, they imagine certain events having occurred, but yet in reality, many of those events did not occur. And we find that even with children, we find that before the age of 4, memories are actually very difficult for them to accurately recall, episodically speaking, but yet they remember how to do specific behaviors that they learned early on in their lives, but yet specific events in their lives before the age of 4 are very, very difficult. So here we find that this happens a lot, that children tend to report these types of events having happened to them, yet in reality, these things did not actually happen. Now, we're also going to touch upon a very interesting idea in our lecture this week, that we're going to talk about weapons focus. We've touched upon this topic in some of our previous lectures, but here I'll re-mention this idea that with weapons focus, if there is a deadly weapon in our environment, we are much more likely to fixate on the weapon rather than on other objects, thus potentially leading to distortions in the way that we recall individuals who we actually saw in our environment. When we view eyewitness identifications, what are some of the potential problems that we actually encounter with eyewitness identifications? Number one of the major concerns that we always have is how instructions are being given out to individuals who are now selecting a perpetrator while they're in a private situation, such as in an identification room, where they can actually see the perpetrators or potential individuals who may be the criminal. So in other words, the individuals in the lineup versus the individuals in the lineup not being able to see the individual who may be signaling them out. So whenever it is that we look at these potential problems, one of the key issues is how is it that we are giving the instructions to the individual? If we say things such as the perpetrator may or may not be present, that may actually reduce the likelihood that an innocent person will actually be accused, versus if you use statements such as please make sure that you select one of the individuals in the lineup, or out of these individuals in the lineup, who is the one who attacked you, or out of all these individuals, who is it that you most say is familiar to you. All of those different things are now indicating that there has to be somebody there present that is actually responsible for the situation, responsible for the crime. So here, making sure that we keep unbiased statements is going to be ideal for us to reduce that likelihood of actually identifying innocent individuals. Now, we also see that if we use simultaneous versus sequential presentation, this may potentially also affect the way that individuals actually select perpetrators. Now, if we use the presentation of perpetrators individually versus all of them together, we can actually see that with sequential presentation, so in other words, one right after another, we actually see relative judgments being made. So the person most similar to the actual perpetrator is then selected in this particular case versus everyone being given. So out of the two, what would probably be more likely to actually help an individual make the correct assertion of the perpetrators that are actually present? Using a simultaneous presentation method would actually be preferred, because now everyone is there. And potentially, again, here, looking at this aspect of the perpetrator may or may not be present, now allows the individual to look across everyone at the same time, not allowing them to make this relative judgment of, well, out of all of them, I think that this is the one person that looked the most familiar to me, and it typically tends to be one of the first individuals or one of the last individuals who's actually selected in the presentation of the perpetrators. Now, we also see that post-lineup feedback is very, very important in the way in the role that it actually plays, in the way that we actually then think about the perpetrators later on. So let's say, for instance, that you were to select individual number 5, but you weren't 100% sure it was individual number 5, but let's say, for instance, you're 50% sure or 60% sure that the individual was number 5. If now somebody says things like good job, or if we say things like yes, all right, if you make now this idea that, hey, you did a good job or that you made the correct assertion, now all of a sudden it changes you from having maybe and potentially some doubt about the individual that you selected to now having 100% certainty about the individual. And we've talked about this idea of confidence associated with other lectures, in that if we actually use statements like I'm 100% confident or I'm 100% sure it was that person, people tend to believe that much more rather than saying, well, I think it may have been that person. So here, going in with confidence is normally better, but yet that plays a role also in terms of the way that individuals are going to perceive the way that you actually talk about the perpetrator that is in question. Now, one of the things that we also have to keep certain is that confidence is not always a good predictor of memory content. We've seen this in our previous lectures, that just because an individual says, hey, I remember seeing that person, I'm 100% confident, that does not necessarily mean that that's always going to be the case, that you are 100% correct in that situation. Now, there always are some biases that may occur in lineup situations. If there are similarities between perpetrators versus filler perpetrators, then it makes it very, very easy or difficult to actually identify somebody, even if that individual may be maybe innocent. Now here, for instance, let's say that the perpetrator you assume here that attacked you or that attacked somebody else and that you were witness of the crime was, let's say, for instance, Hispanic. And they bring in individuals, but then they have very light-skinned Hispanic individuals and one individual who is stereotypical of what a Hispanic would be assumed to look like. Here, that would play into your bias, and you're much more likely to select the individual who fits into the stereotypical idea of what a Hispanic individual would be versus individuals who are very light skinned but yet still fill in the Hispanic ethnicity. So here, making sure that there are similarities between the perpetrators is going to be much more effective for the individual to try to really make the correct assertion, or even saying, you know what, I'm not really sure, I have doubts, versus them just selecting somebody because it fits into their specific attitudinal biases. So here we see that this idea of lineups has actually been used a lot, and especially the media seems to play a very, very big role in terms of trying to identify individuals. And here again, this is a very good example of looking at the similarity between the individuals. So here, are the individuals really the same? No, they're all different heights, they're different weights, they're different ethnicities, different postures, so on and so forth, that may potentially then contribute to your decision making. So we have to keep in mind that all these potential issues are going to be vital for the success of you actually identifying the correct individual. Now, when we think about trying to improve eyewitness testimonies, because that's always a very big issue here, how do we actually improve eyewitness testimonies? Well, one of the things that we may want to think about is using what are called open-ended questions. Think of these like not survey questions, but for instance, essay questions that you find on an exam, that we say something to the degree of, the American Revolution was won on the following dates. Please explain in your own words how the war was won. And now here, it's up to you to describe that situation. Same thing happens here. With an open-ended question, even for eyewitnesses, we rather say things like, tell me what happened, or can you walk me through what actually happened during the event, allowing individuals to create their own story, so that way they create their own version of the story rather than us having to fill in information. So it's very, very important that during the questioning of individuals who are present at a crime or at a crime scene, that one of the things that we don't do is that we don't probe them and push them along. So don't give them information. So when you say that the individual was a little bit of a darker skin, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that the individual may have potentially been Hispanic? Do you think that the individual may have potentially been African American? So now you're specifically telling them, you fit them into this category. You said this, now we're going to go ahead and confirm it with these specific ethnicities. Well, what if it was a Caucasian individual who may have actually just stayed out in the sun too long, and they may have a really nice suntan, right? They may have had a sunburn and now they have a suntan, or whatever the case may be. So their skin may have been a little bit darker than what you would be accustomed to seeing for a Caucasian individual. So we have to keep those things in mind too, that we can't lead people down specific paths to the identification of individuals. So it's much more important for us to be allowing individuals with open-ended questions for them to provide their own story in their own time, in their own mind frame, so that way they could provide us with correct information rather than providing us with errors of commission or even errors of omission. What are errors of commission? Errors of commission are where we add in information that did not actually occur. So we're adding in information to fill in the story, so that way it makes sense. Errors of omission are where we actually keep information out that was actually supposed to be present and is vital for our understanding of the events as well. So when we use things like open-ended questions, a very, very useful technique, so that way they reduce the observer bias, this idea that the belief that one has to be the perpetrator, because here, when you're asked about a situation or you're asked to go into a lineup, people here assume that if you go into a lineup, the right person has to be there. You don't go in assuming, oh, the wrong person might be here, or the right person may not even be present. So here, we don't really think about that. You assume here that one of the individuals has to be the individual who actually committed the crime. We can also use what's called the cognitive interview. With cognitive interviews, we again begin with open-ended questions, allowing participants to tell us the story in their own way. But now what we do is we allow them to be placed in a similar context or even at the crime scene, so that way that information helps bring up or cue the right information about the event. So again, we talked about this with the specificity principle, that if you study in a specific location and then you take the exam in that location, your exam performance will actually be a little bit higher than if you study for the exam in a specific location, but yet you take the exam in a different location, because you actually use the environmental cues as cues, so that way they can prime up the information associated with what we learned or what it is that we created in memory. So same thing happens here. We ask the individual to place themselves mentally. So imagine yourself in that situation. Where were you? What were you doing? What were you grabbing? So on and so forth. Where were you looking? Or we can actually put the individual in the crime scene depending on what their mental health state is at that time. We can also use what are called double-blind lineup administrations. Now, with double-blind lineup administrations, neither the witness nor the interviewer actually have any knowledge of associated with who is or who is not the perpetrator, or even if the perpetrator is present or not. By not having the information from the interviewer or the participant or the witness in this particular case know that the perpetrator is or is not present, actually will help reduce the incidence of actually identifying innocent individuals. Now, let's shift our focus here to now talking about false memories, because that's a big issue here that we have to consider, that even though individuals now are reporting events that happened to them because they were a witness to a specific crime, what happens in the case where we create false memories? So in some of our previous videos here that we've actually seen in this lecture, or that you should have watched in this lecture, you saw that when individuals reported back information, they actually reported wrong information. So why is it that they reported the wrong information? Essentially what they've done is they've created a false memory. In the primacy and recency example that we covered this semester, you did the exact same thing. Over 95% of you told me that that sleep had occurred, but in reality sleep had not occurred. Why did that happen? Well, ultimately we create false memories. So here the following is a story associated with the creation of false memories. I recommend that you take a couple of minutes to read this. You can go ahead and pause the video at this time and read through it, or on one of the slides that you may have printed out or that you have on your computer, so that way you can read through the story associated with false memories. Now, looking at this idea of false memories, again, Elizabeth Loftus has actually done lots of research associated with this idea of witness identification, criminal identification through eyewitness identification, and also the issues of false memories. One of the most famous studies that Elizabeth Loftus actually conducted many years ago was this issue or this idea that could we create or implant a false memory into an individual of having ever been lost in a shopping mall. Now, these types of research studies were actually the very first of their kind, that we had never really thought about this idea of, can we really implant false information? Because the idea was always, well, no, I can't implant false information because I'm assuming here that no one else is in control of my memory except for me. So I'm the one who creates that information. But can we provide suggestions to you, or even set up a situation that potentially may have actually happened to you and then you kind of roll with it? And the answer is actually yes. It happens quite frequently. So one of the ways that she actually did this is she actually had individuals who were the parents or the siblings of the participant of her research study give the original memory. And in the original memory, no one actually got lost. But yet, these individuals were told 3 specific stories about their childhood experiences. So they had never actually ever been lost in the mall for any given period of time, but yet one of those stories actually included a situation where they had gotten lost in the mall. And according to Elizabeth Loftus, she told everybody that you got lost around the age of 5. So again, that age of 5 is, well, I was really, really young, so I may not really remember quite accurately, and this may have potentially happened to me. And yet you're not too old where people are saying, no, I remember that specifically happening or not happening because that was last week that you're telling me that happened, and that never actually happened. So picking an age that the participants were quite far away from, and most of our participants were between the ages of 18 to 20. So here, anywhere between 13 to 15 years have passed between when it is that this supposed event actually happened. So according to Elizabeth Loftus, the story that they create is that the individual had been lost for an extended period of time. They were crying, they asked for help, they were comforted by an elderly woman, and finally they were reunited with their family members. Now, here are the results for what we actually find associated with Elizabeth Loftus's study. At the very first time this information is presented to individuals, no one remembers this event. Everyone says, nope, that did not actually happen. I don't remember that, or yeah, I don't remember that ever happening to me. The second time around that they actually get interviewed, now they start reporting. Over 20%, or just about 20% of subjects or participants here are reporting that these false events actually occurred, that yeah, I actually got lost in the mall. At time 3 now, over 20% are reporting that this event actually happened to them. Roughly about 25% or so are reporting that this happens. Now, why does this actually happen? Well, it happens because the more and more and more that we allow you to work on that information and that you go home and you mull over it, especially something like that, man, it really allows your imagination to go and for you to roll with this idea and think that this might have potentially happened to you. And it becomes a very real scenario that you start adding in all this imagery. what you were wearing, what mall you were in, where you were, what store did you walk into, where you were crying, so on and so forth. So very interestingly, Elizabeth Loftus actually recorded some of her participants discussing this incident of them being lost in the mall. And again, here I've provided the video for you so that way you can just click on the link, or you can click on the link that's in the description as well, so you can have whatever option you would like, so that way you can watch the video interview associated with one of the participants in this particular situation. So it's incredible how beyond just individuals saying, yes, I remember that event having actually occurred to me. Number two, their confidence increases that, yes, I'm 100% this actually happened to me. And then number three, they start putting in great amounts of details associated with the event. So in other words, hey, I remember wearing a blue jumpsuit, and I was wearing a coat because it was cold outside, and I went up to this elderly woman and she was wearing this kind of dress, etc., etc., etc. So all this information that in reality never even happened. So it's incredible that we can implant something just through suggestion to individuals. And it becomes a very scary thought to us that if we are suggestible to this, that means everybody's suggestible to this. Now, granted, we're not all suggestible to every single thing, and we're going to talk about certain aspects that may hinder us from creating these false memories, but yet none of us are saved from creating false memories. And to be honest, I'm always one of those big proponents that we all have false memories for everything, because it's not realistic for me to have knowledge of every single thing that has ever happened to me in every single one of my memories, even though they may be explicit memories, so these aspects of episodic memory. Because even with episodic memory, we even saw there that individuals would have to actually fill in some of the information. We use schemas and scripts to fill in that missing information to make it work for us. Because if not, we have tons of little gaps and holes in our story that don't make it seem to make sense. So I'm always arguing that we actually have false memories for everything. Just that some parts of that memory are true, and then we add in false information. And to be honest, I've always been a very big proponent of always saying a lie is not a lie unless you believe in it. So a lie is not a lie if you believe it to be true. And that's actually something that I've always thought of in my entire life, that you can't ever change someone's idea if they think that it is truth. And that happens a lot in our lives, right? That we tell people, no, that never happened to you. No, it happened to me, or whatever the case may be. Or you said this and I said that. But yet we're 100% certain, and that person may be wrong and we may be right, but yet you can't take that away from them. And even, you go to bed and you're thinking to yourself, man, I can't believe that person left here thinking that it was them who went through this experience, or it was them who said this particular piece of information. So it's always quite interesting to see those kinds of events unfolding in certain situations. Now, the key question then is always the following by everyone. How do I create false memories? Now, I don't want you to think that I'm trying to teach you how to create false memories in individuals because it's awesome and that we should create false memories in individuals. I'm telling you this information because I want you to be aware that we can create false memories, and it's not that hard to create false memories either. And aside from creating false memories, we have to be conscious and cognizant that we have to be careful with the way that we actually explain things to individuals, because we may actually contribute to creating false memories, and we don't actually want to do that. Now, one of the ways that we can actually do this is by using what's called imagination inflation. With imagination inflation, it's essentially having you imagine that something happened to you in your life. Even though that event did not actually happen, we allow you to allow your imagination to run wild. And the more wild your imagination gets, the easier it becomes for you to believe that that event actually happened to you. Because you start now creating emotional attachments to certain situations, or even placing yourself in a situation that you were in, and now adding fluff, if you want, to the story, now makes it seem like a real part of the story. And one of the key things here that we have to keep in mind is that we have to have things that actually could potentially occur in our world. We cannot have information that is not physically possible or temporally possible. So in other words, it could have never happened to me because I wasn't born at that time. Well, now that process has failed to implant that false memory. But rather, it has to be something that is realistic that the individual could have gone through, and also that it happens in a specific time frame that is also realistic in its nature. Now, we do note that there are impossible memories that exist. We know that before the age of 1, actually before the age of 4, we have very few reports of individuals reporting specific episodic memories and being correct about them and correct about the details, but yet they may remember some general ideas about the issue or about that memory. But before age 1, people report all the time that they remember their birth or they remember their first birthday or this or that. And to be honest, it's actually not real. It's actually impossible for individuals to remember their first birthday or remember their births, because at that point, our brains are not sophisticated enough to being able to create those complex memories. And to be honest, when you think about your birth was kind of a traumatic time. You don't want to remember that. I don't want to remember my birth or any situation aside from that. So when you think about your memories and how far you can go back in your memories don't actually go back that far. So it really stops around age 4, age 5. But before then, it all seems to be kind of this, what was I doing? And when you see pictures, you're like, oh yeah, I totally remember that. Well, you really don't. Or you remember bits and pieces, or you remember the story that people told you about that event. And I'm actually going to show you a particular example of this that I've gone through in my life. Now, one interesting thing that we find here is that we encounter what's called infantile amnesia, where infants that we as individuals do not remember what happened to us as infants. And to be honest, again, it's part of this aspect of our brains are still developing and growing and becoming much more sophisticated to be able to handle some of these things. And to be honest, we all kind of go through this potential issue here. Hypnotism is a big issue that we won't touch upon too much in our lecture today or this semester, because I'm not a big proponent of hypnotism. And to be honest with you, using hypnotic techniques to help individuals remember information that was before age 1 or even before age 2 or 3 or of traumatic events sometimes is not very reliable and or valid methods. Now, we also look at the power of suggestion as being a very big issue associated with the way that we can create false memories. The more and more and more we suggest, and also the more suggestibility that an individual is willing to take, is going to make the creation of false memories easier and easier and easier. So always here providing that information over and over and over, and also having people corroborate the event itself are going to help create those specific memories in those specific situations. So having an individual corroborate the story makes it a much more effective memory for them to implant, and thus potentially leading the individual to later on being able to provide a false memory. Now here again, I have some videos for you all to watch, so I would recommend going through and watching these videos before continuing on. These videos are quite short, and they just talk about the creation of false memories and also how individuals look at this idea of false memories as well. So again, we see, kind of wrapping up with this discussion associated with false memories, that even when individuals report that as very young infants they're able to record or report having had the experience or the memory associated with an event, it's actually quite unlikely that this has actually ever happened. Now, when we think about the creation of false memories, 3 very effective strategies to create false memories, aside from just the ones that we've discussed previously. Number 1, if we have pressure by an authority figure, a researcher, or a peer in your group, it's much more likely that you're going to have this information being recalled later on, because if the authority figure is telling you that this has actually happened in the past, it's much more likely then that it has occurred in the past, and you're the one who created the fault in not remembering the information correctly. Number 2, memory construction through imagination is going to be very effective. So using that imagination inflation component is going to be very, very good to being able to create these false memories. Now, do not get this aspect of imagination confused with using imagery techniques to learn information. Here we're saying allowing your imagination to run with information that is false in its nature or that may partially be false allows for the creation and for the formation of that memory to take place. And third, there's no encouragement to think of the construction as being real or not. So one of the things that you always want to try to discourage them from ever questioning the idea that the memory is not real. So don't give them time to think about that memory being true or not, but rather always just convince them that it is true, and it is true, and it is true, and then changing the conversation to something else. So using these ideas of false memory are very important for us because it does also give us an idea of how memories are going to be created for individuals who are witnesses to a specific crime, especially when they're very traumatic events, but yet individuals are forcing them to create an experience in discussing what it is that they've already gone through. So it's very important to understand especially with eyewitness testimonies, that they're receiving that peer pressure from an authority figure, in this particular case being a police officer or a law enforcement agent as a whole, or even a lawyer or a judge asking them that they have to give the information. So in those specific instances, they may allow their imagination to run a little bit in creating false information. So here we need to see that the frequency of suggestion is frequent, right? We have that occur multiple times. A strong bond is then going to occur with the memory. And we also have the individual retrieve the information continuously, because the more times that they bring that information out and we talk about it, the more times it's going to probably become salient, and it's going to have this true component or this true aspect being attached to the individual. Now here, if you're probably wondering who this good-looking guy is, that is your instructor this semester. That is me on my first birthday. This is my false memory that I actually have here for you. I have this false memory because I believed for the very longest time that I remembered my first birthday. I remembered very vividly. I can even still picture it right now as I'm discussing this lecture. If I close my eyes and don't look at the picture, I still can remember thinking to myself, I remember my first birthday sitting on the table with the cake next to me, but the cake was different. The cake, I remember having little clown ornaments on it. A little clown candle ornaments that it had on there. I was wearing this little toy soldier outfit. I remember my dad taking the picture of me in this particular instance, and there being toys or presents to my left. So over here on the right side of the picture. And if you're probably thinking, yeah, I think the presents are a lie. There were presents there. People liked me when I was growing up, and I got lots of presents. It's my first birthday, so let me think about that at least, right? Let that be part of my false memory. But in discussions with my family later on, when I would always bring this up, and I would say, like, yeah, I remember my first birthday, and everyone would say, like, it's not true. I taught classes all about false memory and about the creations of false memory, and I knew that this also couldn't be plausible, but yet I strongly believed that it was true, that I could remember my very first birthday. And one of the things that actually dissuaded me from then believing that I actually had the right information was in discussions with my mother, because I was telling my mom that I remembered about this, and my mom was like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. And she gave me all this wrong information. And the thing that pushed her over the edge was when I said, and I remember Dad taking the picture. And my mom got very upset. And she said, that's impossible because I'm the one who took the pictures. Your dad had left to go pick up one of your aunts and unfortunately did not arrive in time to actually take the picture with the cake because you were already fussy, and I put you down to the cake so that way I could have a picture of you with the cake on your first birthday. She's like, so it's a lie that you're telling me that you remember that information. And then I thought about it and I was like, wow, so she actually remembers it, because for her, she was a lot older, very vivid. I asked my father, my dad was like, oh yeah, I never took a picture of you when you were at your birthday. He's like, I wasn't there. I went out to go pick up one of your aunts and I didn't make it back in time for the pictures. So even he corroborates the story that I was wrong in this particular case. Now, potentially they're both lying to me and creating a false memory, but when I think about it, logically speaking, it is impossible for me to actually have this information, to have this content, because again, if we look at the aspects and research associated with infantile amnesia, it's much more likely that I'm not going to remember this event. But then why did I create that event? Why did I actually create that idea associated with this event? Why did I create that memory? And the answer is, all my life, since I was a little kid, I always got told about my first birthday. Every time my birthday rolled around, my parents would always tell me about that story. They wouldn't tell me all the details, but it wasn't until I started telling them that I had the information that now my information contradicted their information. But like a good schema is in its usefulness to me, it filled in the missing information. So I created this false memory based on the story that they were telling me, but yet then I filled in the information to actually support the idea. So we see here that none of us are safe. I teach these things, and I'm not safe from false memory creation. And I'll be honest with you guys, I still remember my first birthday. I'll leave you with that. All right, that wraps up our discussion for this week associated with memory and the legal system. I hope you enjoyed this week's lecture, and I hope you enjoyed the reading and also the in-class activities. I had a lot of fun finding them for you and putting them up for you, so I hope that you've enjoyed them. Have a good rest of your day, have a good week, and please let me know if you have any questions.